The research station had been designed for long-term study of historical Velrathi military technology, not for beauty, but for function and security. Massive bays holding decommissioned vessels from various periods of Velrathi history, analysis facilities where human and Velrathi researchers worked together cataloging and understanding systems that spanned centuries of technical development. Dr. James Reeves had been working here for 14 months as part of the Interspecies Knowledge Exchange Program. His specialty was xenotechnology integration, understanding how different species approached similar engineering problems, identifying principles that worked across biological and cultural frameworks. The work was fascinating. It was also, under normal circumstances, completely safe. These were museum pieces, essentially, decommissioned vessels that had been carefully preserved for historical study, but that posed no active threat to anyone. The Sovereign's wrath was different from most of the station's collection, in ways that James had spent months trying to fully understand. It was older, approximately 800 years old, from the dynasty that had preceded the current ruling house. It had been the personal flagship of Empress Catherine III, who had commanded it during the unification wars that transformed dozens of fractured Velrathi territories into a single coherent empire. It was also completely sealed. Not mechanically sealed. There were no physical locks preventing access to the interior. The ship was sealed by its own security protocols, which required biometric authentication matched to Imperial bloodline DNA, specifically to DNA markers that had been unique to Empress Catherine's dynasty. Without that DNA match, the ship was inert. No power, no systems, no response to any attempted activation or override. James had studied the ship's specifications extensively, read the historical accounts of its capabilities, examined the external architecture, reviewed the technical assessments that previous researchers had compiled. But he'd never been inside it in any meaningful sense, because inside a dead ship was just empty corridors and dark systems. Until the day the emergency sirens activated. The attack came without warning, or rather, with warning that the station's defensive coordinator had received, but hadn't had time to fully assess before the hostile vessels were already executing their assault. A rogue faction. That's what the initial reports called them, a splinter group that the intelligence briefings had mentioned but hadn't characterized as an immediate threat to a research facility. The intelligence assessments had been wrong. James was in one of the analysis labs when the sirens began, and his first instinct was to check whether this was a drill. It wasn't. The station's defensive systems activated immediately, shields, point defense, the kind of automated response that was designed to deter opportunistic attacks. But the incoming vessels weren't opportunistic raiders. They were organized and armed with weapons that overwhelmed the station's defensive capabilities within minutes. The evacuation protocols activated. James moved toward his designated emergency station, along with dozens of other researchers and support personnel, following the drills they'd practiced but never expected to execute for real. Then, the station-wide announcement. All personnel to Operations Center. Emergency defensive meeting. All personnel. That wasn't in the standard protocols. That suggested something beyond standard evacuation was happening. James reached the operations center to find it crowded with everyone who'd been able to respond. Researchers, security staff, the few military personnel who were assigned to the station for coordination rather than actual defense. Commander Seris, the station's defensive coordinator, was standing at the main display showing the tactical situation. Her expression was controlled in the way that suggested she was managing something that was not controlled at all. "We can't hold," she said without preamble. "The attackers have firepower that exceeds our defensive capabilities. Standard protocol would be immediate evacuation. But evacuation means abandoning technology that these attackers want, technology that could be weaponized against civilian populations if they acquire it." She looked across the assembled personnel. I need defensive capability this station doesn't have. I need a warship. Her eyes moved to the main bay visible through the operations center's observation windows, specifically to the Sovereign's Wrath sitting in its dedicated dock, dark and silent and completely useless. That vessel, if it were active, could defend this station against the entire attacking force. But it's sealed behind security protocols that require DNA matched to a dynasty that ended 600 years ago. She paused. We're going to attempt activation anyway. Every person on this station is going to try. Someone's DNA might have enough compatibility to trigger partial systems. We need anything, shields, weapons, basic power. Anything is better than abandoning the station without resistance. James understood immediately that this was desperation rather than strategy. The chances of anyone randomly having DNA compatible with an 800-year-old Imperial bloodline were essentially zero. But zero wasn't quite the same as impossible, and Commander Seris was choosing to try something impossible over accepting certain failure. All security restrictions on the Sovereign's Wrath are suspended, Seris continued. Everyone to the bridge, touch the command interface in sequence quickly. James joined the line of people moving toward the Sovereign's Wrath's bridge, through corridors that had been sealed behind glass for months, into a space that had been studied from outside but never accessed. The bridge was architecturally magnificent even while dark, designed to impress as much as to function, because 800 years ago the Empress's flagship was as much political statement as military asset. At the center of the bridge was the throne core, the command nexus where the Empress would have commanded operations. And before the throne core was the command interface, a crystalline panel approximately 1 meter square, its surface etched with patterns that looked partly technological and partly artistic. This was the biometric lock. Touch it with the right DNA, and the ship would recognize Imperial authority and activate. Touch it with wrong DNA, and nothing happened. James watched person after person place their hands on the interface. Some held contact for just a moment. Some held it longer as though sustained contact might somehow convince the ship to respond. Nothing happened. The ship remained dark and silent. 43 people had tried before James's turn came. He placed his hand on the crystalline surface without any expectation beyond completing the formality so the next person could try. The ship responded instantly. Not partially, not with hesitation or gradual system activation. Completely and immediately. The bridge flooded with light, not harsh, but the warm amber illumination that Velrathi design used for operational spaces. The throne core pulsed, its surface patterns shifting from dormant dark to active luminescence. Displays activated around the bridge's perimeter, showing ship status in script that James recognized as archaic Velrathi, readable but different from modern written language. The information they displayed was clear even before translation. Power generation at full capacity, weapons systems ready, defensive shields on standby, propulsion nominal. The ship's AI spoke in archaic Velrathi, its voice resonant and formal. Imperial authority recognized. Sovereign's Wrath operational, awaiting command. The bridge went absolutely silent, except for the ambient hum of active systems. James took his hand off the interface slowly, half expecting the ship to power down again. It didn't. The systems remained fully active, waiting. Every person on the bridge was staring at him. Commander Seris, who had been coordinating the activation attempts from near the bridge entrance, had frozen in place. Her expression had progressed through shock into something more complex, recognition that something impossible had just happened, and that the implications were profound. "That's not possible," she said. Her voice was controlled but carried an undertone that suggested she was processing multiple things simultaneously. "The ship requires DNA match to Empress Catherine's dynasty. You're human. There's no biological pathway for compatibility." James looked at his hand, still tingling slightly from contact with the interface, and then at the active bridge around him. "I don't understand this any better than you do." Later, Seris said, making a visible decision to prioritize the immediate crisis over the impossible thing that had just occurred. "Can you operate this vessel?" "I don't know," James said honestly. "I've studied the specifications for months. I know the theoretical capabilities, but theoretical knowledge versus actual command are different things. The alternative is watching this station get destroyed and this technology captured," Seris said. "I'm authorizing you to attempt defensive operations. I'll coordinate from the operations center." She moved toward the bridge exit, then paused. "The throne core is the primary command interface. Sit there if you're going to try to control the ship." James approached the throne core with the particular caution of someone who was about to interact with a system that had just demonstrated it recognized him in ways that violated every expectation. He sat. The throne core responded to contact, its surface conforming slightly to his body, patterns shifting to accommodate his specific physiology in ways that suggested the ship could adapt its interface across biological differences. Information flooded into his awareness, not through displays or readouts, those were present but secondary. The ship was communicating directly, feeding him tactical awareness, system status, capabilities, all translated into concepts he could understand without needing to parse interface controls. He could feel the attacking vessels through the ship's sensors, could understand the station's vulnerability, could perceive the Sovereign's Wrath's capabilities as extensions of possibility rather than as technical specifications he needed to manually execute. It was overwhelming and intuitive simultaneously. He activated defensive shields first, not by pressing controls but by intending it, and the ship responding to that intention. The shields expanded to cover the research station, because the Sovereign's Wrath had been designed to protect entire fleet formations, and the research station was small enough to shelter completely within its defensive envelope. The attacking vessels, which had been moving in for final assault, suddenly faced a situation they hadn't anticipated. A command warship from the Unification Wars, fully active, its weapons systems powering up with the distinctive energy signatures that 800 years of subsequent weapons development still couldn't quite match. They broke off, retreated. Within minutes, they had jumped to faster-than-light transit and were gone. The immediate threat was over. James remained in the throne core, unwilling to break contact with the ship until he was certain the danger had passed, feeling the Sovereign's Wrath around him like a living presence that had been waiting centuries to wake. The aftermath of the emergency became its own crisis within hours. Commander Seris contacted Velrathi Imperial Command to report the station's status and to explain, as much as she could explain, what had occurred. James could hear the conversation from where he remained in the throne core, still maintaining contact with the ship systems, monitoring the space around the station for any indication of renewed threat. The response from Imperial Command was immediate and absolute. The station was being placed under direct Imperial authority. A fleet was being dispatched. No one was to leave or communicate externally until the situation had been properly assessed. Within 18 hours, the station was surrounded by Velrathi military vessels maintaining positions that were simultaneously protective and constraining. Within 24 hours, a delegation from the Imperial Court itself arrived. Multiple transport vessels carrying officials whose presence indicated this was being treated at the highest levels of government. The delegation was led by High Chancellor Cathara, one of the most senior officials in the Velrathi government, accompanied by genealogical experts, security officials whose specific roles weren't explained, and several advisors whose function James couldn't determine. They wanted to understand how a human had activated a ship that should only respond to DNA from a dynasty that had ended 600 years ago. The genealogical experts conducted extensive testing, not just simple DNA sampling, but comprehensive genetic profiling compared against historical records that James hadn't known existed. Preserved biological samples from Empress Catherine's dynasty, genetic markers that had been documented for succession authentication purposes, reference libraries that spanned centuries. What they discovered took 3 days to confirm, and another 2 days before they were willing to formally present to High Chancellor Cathara and Commander Seris in James's presence. The senior genealogist, an elderly Velrathi woman named Vetha who carried herself with the authority of someone whose expertise was unquestionable, delivered the findings with the controlled precision of someone presenting data that would have political consequences she couldn't control. Dr. Reeves carries genetic markers that match Empress Catherine's dynasty with specificity that cannot be coincidence or random variation. Not approximate matches. Exact matches for 17 rare markers that were unique to that bloodline, and that are not found in the general Velrathi population. She displayed the comparative analysis, James's genetic profile alongside historical records, the matched markers highlighted. The only explanation that fits the data is direct descent from Catherine's dynasty. Somehow, despite historical records indicating the dynasty ended without surviving heirs, someone from that bloodline survived, left Velrathi space, and across centuries and species barriers that should be biologically impossible to cross, produced a descendant whose DNA retained sufficient markers to activate security protocols locked to that specific genetic signature. High Chancellor Cathara looked at the data for a long moment, then looked at James. "You understand," she said, "that this is not a technical curiosity. This is a constitutional crisis." Over the following week, James received intensive education in Velrathi Imperial succession law. Specifically, the laws as they were written during Empress Catherine's reign, which had never been formally superseded because they'd become irrelevant when her dynasty ended. The current ruling house, the house that Commander Seris belonged to, had taken power through political succession. When Catherine's granddaughter died without heirs, the empire's noble houses had negotiated a new succession that placed House Vale in power. That succession had been legitimate under the law because there were no surviving claimants from Catherine's line. But succession law from Catherine's period was explicit. Direct bloodline descendants held rights that superseded political succession. If a legitimate descendant existed, that descendant's claim took precedence. The law had been written that way because Catherine's dynasty had consolidated power partly through demonstrating that their bloodline carried something special, genetic markers that allowed them to interface with certain technologies that others couldn't access, capabilities that they'd leveraged as proof of legitimacy. The sovereign's wrath was one of those technologies. It had been deliberately designed to only respond to Catherine's bloodline, serving as constant demonstration that the dynasty's authority was embedded in their biology itself. And now it had responded to James. High Chancellor Cathara explained the political situation in a private meeting. "You are not Velrathi. You are human, but you carry DNA from the dynasty that ruled this empire for 3 centuries. Under our oldest succession laws, the laws written by that dynasty to protect its own authority, that DNA is itself a form of legitimate claim to imperial authority." "I don't want authority over your empire," James said. "I'm a researcher. I was trying to help defend the station." "Your wants are legally irrelevant," Cathara said, not unkindly. "You exist. Your DNA exists. The ship recognized you. Those facts have political consequences, regardless of your intentions." She leaned forward. "The question facing the empire now is how to address a situation our current legal framework was never designed to handle. A legitimate heir to the founding dynasty who is not Velrathi, who has no cultural connection to our civilization, who doesn't want the authority his bloodline grants him, and whose very existence challenges the legitimacy of the ruling house that has governed successfully for 6 centuries. James began to understand the scope of what had happened when he touched that interface. He wasn't just someone who'd activated an old ship. He was a walking constitutional crisis. And the sovereign's wrath remained bound to him, responding to his commands and no one else's, a constant physical demonstration that his connection to the founding dynasty was real and ineradicable. The political resolution took months of negotiation between factions James only partially understood. Some officials wanted him to formally renounce any claim to succession rights, to make a legal declaration that severed his connection to the founding dynasty's authority. Others wanted to integrate him into the current imperial structure, acknowledge his bloodline connection while subordinating it to House Vale's authority. A smaller but vocal faction believed he should be recognized as the legitimate heir, that House Vale's authority had always been contingent on the absence of surviving descendants from Catherine's line, and that his existence meant that contingency had ended. Commander Seris, who had become something between a liaison and an advisor to James during this period, explained the competing interests during one of their regular conversations. My family has ruled this empire for 6 centuries. We've maintained stability, prosperity, and peace across dozens of systems. The idea that a human with ancient DNA should displace that because of genetic markers feels absurd. She paused. But I also watched you activate the sovereign's wrath. That ship represents the foundation of our empire's unity. It fought the wars that made us one civilization instead of fractured territories. And it responded to you with recognition that our entire governmental structure is built on respecting. The resolution that emerged was complex, negotiated between House Vale, the noble houses that supported them, and the faction that argued for recognizing James's bloodline authority. James would be formally acknowledged as a descendant of the founding dynasty, with legitimate genetic connection to imperial authority. He would not claim the throne, both because he didn't want it, and because the practical impossibility of a human ruling a Velrathi empire made it untenable. Instead, a new position was created specifically for this situation: Imperial Arbiter of First Dynasty authority. The position recognized his connection to the founding dynasty while integrating it into the current governmental structure. He had specific authorities tied to that bloodline connection. He could activate and command technologies sealed to the founding dynasty's DNA. He had access to historical archives that had been restricted to imperial bloodline. He served as a living bridge to the empire's foundational period. He did not have governing authority over daily imperial operations. He could not override House Vale's decisions or claim executive power. But his existence and his role fundamentally altered the empire's understanding of its own legitimacy. They could no longer claim authority solely through political succession, because the bloodline succession they thought ended had returned in a form no one had anticipated. The sovereign's wrath remained bound to James, serving as the constant physical proof of his connection to the dynasty that had built the empire. A year after he'd activated the ship, James stood on its bridge with Commander Seris, who had become something more like a colleague than a liaison, someone who understood both the Velrathi political complexity and James's position within it. "You changed our empire," Seris said, "not by wanting to, just by existing and by touching that interface when everyone else's attempts had failed." "I was trying to help defend the station," James said. "Everything else happened because genetics I didn't know I carried matched security protocols I didn't know existed." "Do you regret it?" Seris asked. James thought about this. He'd lost the quiet research career he'd been building. He'd gained authority he'd never wanted and responsibilities that required understanding political dynamics he had no training in. He'd become a bridge between species and dynasties across centuries of history. "No," he said. "It's not what I would have chosen. But the sovereign's wrath woke because I touched it. That means something. And if my existence helps this empire understand its own history more completely, then it matters regardless of whether I wanted it. The ship hummed around them, its systems active and responsive, bound to James in ways that 8 centuries of sealed dormancy hadn't changed. He'd activated a ship powered by royal DNA.